These three pyramids may look like grand royal tombs, but they aren't what you think. For over a century, scholars have assumed that these colossal monuments were built to house the remains of a single king, Pharaoh Sneferu. But there's a problem. Despite countless expeditions, extensive documentation, and modern archaeological tools, not a single sarcophagus has ever been found inside any of them. Not one. That's not a minor oversight. That's a foundational contradiction. We've been taught that pyramids were tombs, yet the physical evidence refuses to cooperate. The question is no longer how Sneferu built three pyramids. The real question is, why would one king build three massive pyramids and not be buried in a single one? If these pyramids weren't actually tombs, then one of the most foundational beliefs about ancient Egypt is based on a misunderstanding. For generations, Egyptology has operated on the assumption that pyramids, by default, must be burial monuments. That belief has shaped every theory, every excavation, and every textbook explanation of these structures. But what if that core idea is wrong when evidence contradicts the model, like the complete absence of sarcophagi in all three of Sneferu's pyramids? The response isn't to revise the model, but to explain the evidence away. This kind of circular reasoning doesn't solve mysteries, it protects dogma. If physical evidence is only valid when it supports existing narratives, then we're not doing science, we're telling ourselves stories, and in doing so, we risk building our understanding of history on the ruins of false assumptions. So if you're ready to question what we've been told about ancient Egypt, stay with me, because the real evidence tells a very different story. How can all three pyramids lack a sarcophagus and yet still be called tombs? One of the most glaring problems with the traditional explanation of Sneferu's pyramids is the total absence of a sarcophagus in any of them. In the vast and intricate stone labyrinths built by the ancient Egyptians, the sarcophagus isn't just a symbolic centerpiece, it's supposed to be the entire point of the structure. And yet in Sneferu's three monumental pyramids, Meidum, the Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid, there is not a single stone sarcophagus, not a fragment, not a lid, not a corner chipped off and left behind by time or looters. Nothing. This absence is not just a technicality. In Old Kingdom architecture, sarcophagi were carved from massive blocks of granite or limestone and installed before the pyramid chambers were sealed up during construction. These containers were simply too large and heavy to be inserted afterward. The narrow corridors, angled shafts, and tight chamber spaces make it physically impossible to bring in a full-sized stone sarcophagus once the structure was completed. So when you walk into a pyramid today and see an intact burial chamber with no sarcophagus, that's not just missing a detail, it's missing the entire purpose of the pyramid, at least according to the traditional burial theory. And the counter-argument that looters removed them doesn't hold up under scrutiny. In most other pyramids that were looted, fragments remain. Sarcophagi weren't vaporized. They were smashed, broken, sometimes even partially left in place. Many looted pyramids have sarcophagi so large and cumbersome that tomb robbers simply left them behind or destroyed only the lids in search of valuables inside. Yet in Sneferu's pyramids, which remain in relatively good structural condition compared to many others, there's not a trace of a stone burial container in any of them. This raises a fundamental question that Egyptology has largely sidestepped. If there was never a sarcophagus, was there ever a burial? If there was no burial, were these pyramids truly tombs at all? Some have tried to work around this problem by suggesting that wooden sarcophagi may have been used instead. But this idea doesn't stand up to logical inspection. Wooden sarcophagi in royal pyramids? The surrounding mastabas of nobility, lesser officials, contained massive stone burial containers. Why would the king settle for wood while his court had granite? There is no historical precedent, no physical evidence, and no rational justification for this downgrade in materials. Worse, this line of thinking seems to exist solely to preserve a narrative, not to explore new possibilities. Instead of reevaluating the function of the pyramids based on hard evidence, the academic establishment has doubled down on increasingly far-fetched explanations. But the facts remain simple. No stone sarcophagus, no burial. And if there was no burial, what were these pyramids actually for? When presented with the hard reality that none of Sneferu's 3 pyramids contain a sarcophagus, Egyptologists have not, for the most part, questioned the core assumption that these were tombs. Instead, they've crafted increasingly imaginative theories to explain away the absence, proposals that stretch credibility and prioritize saving the narrative over following the evidence. One of the more common ideas is that Sneferu's sarcophagi were made of wood and have long since decayed. On its face, this might seem plausible. Wood decays. Egypt is ancient. End of story, right? Not quite, because this explanation collapses under closer scrutiny. The royal burial practices of the Old Kingdom didn't favor wood for pharaohs. They used stone, massive, immovable, symbolic stone. That wasn't just tradition, it was engineering and ideology. We have granite sarcophagi from other 4th dynasty burials, including mastabas of lesser nobles. So why would the most powerful man in the kingdom, the builder of 3 pyramids, opt for a biodegradable box? To bridge this contradiction, some scholars argue that the wooden sarcophagi might have been symbolic or temporary. But that only adds to the inconsistency. Temporary. For a pharaoh. And again, there's not even a splinter of wood left in any of these chambers, not even residue or fragments that could be chemically identified. If wood was used, there should be some trace, especially in relatively well-sealed pyramid interiors. But the chambers are silent on this claim. Others go further into speculation. Some propose that the sarcophagus was removed, stolen, repurposed, or ceremonially taken away. Mark Lehner, a respected voice in Egyptology, Dahshur, once claimed that the entire burial chamber itself in the Meidum pyramid may have functioned as a symbolic sarcophagus. That's not an explanation. It's a retreat into metaphor. By that logic, any empty room could be called a tomb, and it raises more questions than it answers. Why, in an age of literal tombs and physical sarcophagi, would one king suddenly opt for a poetic void instead? Even more absurd is the suggestion that a male skeleton found in the Red Pyramid might have belonged to Sneferu himself. If that were true, we'd have to believe that a stone sarcophagus, the entire limestone floor, and any burial goods were removed with surgical precision, while somehow leaving a fragile human skeleton completely intact. That's not just implausible, it's bordering on fantasy. These theories don't reflect a lack of evidence. They reflect a refusal to confront it. Rather than rethinking the purpose of the pyramids, the academic instinct has been to protect the tomb theory at all costs, even if that means proposing scenarios that contradict logic, precedent, and physics. But a theory that needs to bend reality to survive isn't a theory worth defending. At some point, you have to stop patching the hole in the ship and ask if you're sailing in the wrong direction altogether. When all else fails, the simplest explanation is often the most reliable. In the case of Sneferu's missing sarcophagi, common sense offers a clarity that academic theories consistently fail to deliver. If you walk into 3 pyramids, each remarkably intact, and none of them contain a sarcophagus, why stretch for elaborate explanations? The most logical conclusion is also the most overlooked. Maybe these pyramids were never tombs to begin with. This isn't conspiracy thinking, it's basic evidence-based reasoning. Everything we know about Egyptian burial practices in the Old Kingdom suggests that the sarcophagus was central to the design of the pyramid's internal layout. Chambers were not just spaces, they were engineered around the placement and protection of the sarcophagus. So if one pyramid lacked it, perhaps you could attribute it to an anomaly. But 3 from the same pharaoh. That's not coincidence, that's a pattern. When scholars leap to complicated alternatives, symbolic sarcophagi, fully removed stone boxes, wooden containers with no remains, they're bypassing what the physical evidence is plainly saying. It's a clear case of the narrative driving the analysis, not the other way around. The pyramids must be tombs, they say, so whatever evidence is missing must have once been there. That's not how science works. In any other discipline, we would treat the absence of key evidence as a signal to reevaluate the model, not invent ways to preserve it. Now consider the common sense angle. If no sarcophagus is present and no sign of burial exists, not even fragments, not even floor damage where one might have stood, it suggests the structure served a different purpose. This would also explain the renovations, structural adjustments, and the lack of traditional funerary architecture like funerary temples, causeways, or satellite pyramids, especially in the Red Pyramid. Seen through this lens, the pyramid becomes not a failed tomb, but an evolving architectural experiment. That's the rational view. It doesn't deny mystery. It simply resists the temptation to explain everything with increasingly unlikely stories. It asks, what does the evidence suggest? Rather than, how can we make the evidence fit what we already believe? We've reached a point in the debate where physical reality and academic legacy are at odds. And the legacy is winning, not because it's more convincing, but because it's more comfortable. Admitting that these pyramids may not have been tombs would disrupt more than a century of established belief. It would force textbooks to change, documentaries to revise their scripts, and scholars to question careers built on a flawed premise. But real progress comes from questioning. History isn't preserved in stone, it's uncovered in truth. And truth has no allegiance to tradition. So when common sense tells us something's off, maybe we should stop bending the evidence to fit the theory and start reshaping the theory to match the evidence. When evaluating the Meidum and bent pyramids, one thing becomes clear almost immediately. Their upper chambers are architectural oddities. They are disjointed, inconsistent, and riddled with makeshift solutions that stand in stark contrast to the precision typically associated with ancient Egyptian construction. These red flags aren't minor cosmetic flaws. They point to something far more significant. These chambers weren't looted. They were rebuilt, altered, and adjusted, often in ways that make little sense if they were meant as final sealed tombs. Take the upper chamber of the Meidum pyramid, for example. Its corbelling, the stepped inward slanting stones that make up the ceiling, is wildly inconsistent. The sizes of the overhangs vary from one wall to the next. Some corbels are chamfered, others not. The masonry does not align smoothly from wall to wall, and many of the stones are poorly bonded or wedged in with crude mortar and filler. These are not the hallmarks of a burial chamber crafted with reverence and permanence in mind. They look instead like emergency fixes, like a structure being adapted on the fly, long after initial construction. Then there's the matter of the floors. In the bent pyramid, for instance, the upper chamber features evidence of multiple floor levels, pavement lines clinging to the chamber walls that reveal the floor was not a static design element. It was raised, removed, and replaced, potentially multiple times. The chamber itself was found partially filled with loose brickwork and beams that had to be cleared out in the mid-20th century. These aren't typical traits of a plundered tomb. They resemble a work site, not a crime scene. Moreover, the so-called repairs appear in places that suggests the builders were trying to compensate for original flaws, not simply cover up damage. In Meidum, patches were inserted into the chamber walls after construction, clearly meant to smooth out defective areas. The roughest, most poorly cut stones were found high up in the chamber, where access would have been difficult once the pyramid was closed off. In other words, these weren't last-minute additions made during the initial build. They were post-construction corrections. You don't renovate a sealed tomb after the burial, but you might if you're trying to revise its function. These red flags aren't isolated. They repeat across both pyramids and indicate a clear pattern. Chambers that were never fully finished, then later reworked. And in every case, the workmanship of these upper chambers is markedly worse than the craftsmanship seen elsewhere in the same pyramid. This isn't about declining skill. It's about shifting priorities. Something changed. These chambers were originally built with one function in mind, then modified for another. Looters don't do that. Builders do. What we're looking at isn't the aftermath of ancient robbery. It's the visible imprint of experimentation, of trial, error, and redesign. And once you see that pattern, you start to question whether these chambers were ever intended to be final resting places at all. One of the most revealing aspects of the Meidum and Bent pyramids lies in the contrast between their lower and upper chambers. When you compare them directly, it becomes clear that the lower chambers were crafted with significantly more care, precision, and planning. This disparity forces us to re-examine what each chamber was actually intended for, and it raises serious doubts about the traditional assumption that the upper chambers were meant to be burial sites. In the Meidum pyramid, the lower chambers exhibit clean lines, consistent stonework, and large, well-fitted blocks. The pavement consists of massive slabs laid tightly against the walls, with smaller stones used only as minimal spacers. This is classic Old Kingdom craftsmanship, functional and ceremonial, designed to endure. These lower areas feel deliberate, foundational, and confidently executed. By contrast, the upper chamber looks almost like a rush job. The stonework is irregular, the corbelling is misaligned, and there's obvious patching where the original construction fell short. This difference isn't merely aesthetic. In ancient Egyptian architecture, the degree of finish and effort put into a space often correlates directly with its importance. You don't perfect the empty voids and neglect the burial chamber. And yet in both pyramids, the most elaborate or refined features are not found in the presumed burial spaces. This reversal of expectations suggests that the upper chambers, long assumed to be the climax of the structure, may have been an afterthought, or a reconfigured space given a new, unclear role late in the process. In the Bent pyramid, we find the same pattern. The lower chamber is symmetrical, solid, and logical in its layout. The ceiling is flat and carefully balanced. The chamber opens directly from the descending passage and aligns with the expected path of construction. Now shift focus to the upper chamber. It's accessed via a strange and difficult path. It was partially filled with bricks and wooden beams, and it contains structural anomalies like poorly integrated corbels and asymmetrical vaulting. If this was intended as a burial space, why would it be harder to access and worse in quality than the chamber below? The traditional explanation is that the upper chambers were part of an architectural evolution, experiments in creating a more secure or symbolic burial space. But if that's the case, why are the experimental chambers so sloppily built? Why weren't they sealed off with the same precision and ritual care we see in actual royal tombs? Why are there no traces of burial goods, no sarcophagus, not even funerary iconography? One possible answer: they were never meant for burial at all. The design doesn't support it, and the function, as we see from the quality and layout, suggests something else entirely. The evidence leads us to a reinterpretation. The lower chambers may have been the original focal points of the design, possibly for symbolic, structural, or even ceremonial purposes. The upper chambers, they were late-game modifications, adjustments in a project that had already started moving in another direction. And that shift tells us everything about the evolution of pyramid building and Sneferu's still unsolved intent. If there's one message written plainly into the stones of the Meidum and bent pyramids, it's this: these chambers were not abandoned ruins, nor were they desecrated by tomb robbers. They were altered, reworked, and in some cases, entirely reimagined by the original builders themselves. What we often interpret as destruction is, in fact, construction, purposeful renovation in progress. Start with the bent pyramid. Its upper chamber was found partially filled with bricks and long timbers, evidence initially thought to be debris. But look closer, and the interpretation shifts. These weren't leftover scraps or remnants of looting. The bricks were deliberately packed into the chamber, with wooden beams embedded within them, forming a falsework structure. The presence of two distinct floor lines on the walls shows that the chamber's floor was modified at least twice. That's not vandalism, that's planned reconstruction. Ancient looters didn't fill chambers with structural materials, lay down new flooring and patch walls with fresh mortar. Builders did that. The Meidum pyramid tells a similar story. Its upper chamber, as poorly executed as it is, still bears the unmistakable signature of ancient renovation. Large stone patches were inserted into defective areas, as if to bandage flawed or crumbling masonry. The corbels, uneven and misshapen, were later touched up with chamfered edges, a stylistic compromise made when the original stones couldn't be corrected. These are the kinds of repairs you make when you're trying to salvage a space, not seal it off for eternity. Even the floors offer clues. The lower chambers, as discussed, were paved with giant limestone slabs, standard burial architecture, but the upper chamber in Meidum is tiled with smaller, uniformly shaped blocks that could have been brought in later. Why does this matter? Because it's a sign of post-construction intervention. These floor tiles weren't laid down as part of the pyramid's core, they were an overlay. That makes sense if the chamber was being repurposed. It makes no sense at all if it was meant to be permanently sealed after burial. All of this flies in the face of the looting narrative that dominates Egyptology. Looters don't create new floors. They don't install supporting beams. They don't insert patch stones with purpose and symmetry. The idea that these modifications were made by opportunistic grave robbers stretches plausibility to the breaking point. Renovation is the only explanation that fits both the physical evidence and the architectural context, and the implications of that are enormous. Renovation implies dissatisfaction with the original design. It implies the builders, or perhaps even Sneferu himself, wanted to improve or change the function of these chambers. If these pyramids were active works in progress rather than finished tombs, then we're not looking at monuments of death. We're looking at experiments in design, evolving in real time. That perspective turns the entire burial narrative on its head. The bent and Meidum pyramids weren't violated. They were reworked, adapted, and possibly never finished at all. What we call ruins may actually be records of ambition and unfinished visions of a pharaoh trying to solve problems we've only just begun to understand. The Red Pyramid is often called Sneferu's crowning architectural achievement, a perfect pyramid that solved the structural flaws of Meidum and the bent pyramid. It's smooth-sided, symmetrical, and often described as the first truly complete pyramid. But beneath that polished narrative lies a puzzling contradiction. The upper chamber of the Red Pyramid has been extensively excavated downward, yet there's no trace of a sarcophagus, burial goods, or any ritual decoration. Instead, there's a massive pit 4 to 5 meters deep, dug directly into the chamber's floor, and that pit tells a story of its own. The traditional explanation claims the pit is the work of looters, ancient treasure hunters who tunneled in and destroyed everything. But the details of this pit suggest something else entirely. First, consider the precision with which the excavation was carried out. The pit doesn't damage the surrounding walls. The corners remain crisp, the chamber threshold untouched. If tomb robbers dug this out, they were the most careful, disciplined vandals in history. That's not how looting works. Looters cause chaos. They break, hack, and rip through stone in search of valuables, but here we see meticulous removal of materials with intentional preservation of structure. Second, the volume of material missing from the chamber floor is staggering. Based on 19th century drawings by explorer John Perring, the entire elevated floor was carved away and removed. But where did it all go? There's no corresponding debris pile inside the pyramid. The middle chamber below contains only a small amount of rubble, and curiously, the first chamber contains more debris than the second, likely from modern foot traffic. Looters don't take debris out of pyramids. Builders do. This isn't the aftermath of theft. It's the fingerprint of deconstruction. What's more, this chamber is often cited as Sneferu's final resting place. That claim leans entirely on the fact that the Red Pyramid was structurally sound and visually impressive. But that's not evidence, that's assumption. If the chamber was truly a sealed tomb, where is the sarcophagus? Where is the floor it was placed on? Why would any burial scenario involve gutting the chamber from within? The more you examine the pit, the more implausible the looter theory becomes. What makes more sense is that this was part of a planned but abandoned modification. Just like Meidum and the bent pyramid, the Red Pyramid shows signs of intervention, not violation. And if that's true, then the most complete pyramid of all may actually be the one least finished in terms of function. The mystery isn't that a sarcophagus is missing. The mystery is why anyone believed it was ever there in the first place. Because the deeper you go into the Red Pyramid, literally and figuratively, the clearer it becomes. This was not a completed tomb. It was a puzzle that never found its final piece. If the pit inside the Red Pyramid's upper chamber wasn't made by looters, then who carved it? The answer, surprisingly, is carved into the stones themselves. Every detail of the remaining structure reveals the unmistakable fingerprint of the original builders, not the chaotic hand of ancient grave robbers. The way the chamber was altered shows an attention to form and preservation, not destruction. And that challenges the mainstream story in a fundamental way. Let's start with one of the most overlooked yet telling aspects: the preserved walls. Tomb robbery in ancient Egypt was rarely a subtle act. Looters hacked through walls, smashed stone, and tore open sealed spaces to reach their prize. Yet in the Red Pyramid's upper chamber, the walls remain beautifully intact. The sharp corners at the base of the chamber, where the now missing elevated floor once met the walls, are not broken or fractured. Instead, they've been carefully dressed to match the existing smooth plane above. This kind of symmetry isn't accidental. It was deliberate, skillful, and methodical, evidence of craftspeople working with intent. Even more revealing is the condition of the passageway that leads to the chamber. It too shows signs of precise modification. In areas where the floor was removed, the remaining stone edges were smooth, not rough-hewn like you'd expect if this were an act of frantic digging. The lower threshold retains its form, unchipped and sharp. Consider this logically. Can we really believe looters transported multiple tons of limestone out of this chamber without damaging the access corridor or bumping the stonework? And then there's the sequence of dressing marks. The visible lines where the stone walls were finished actually flow downward from the original floor line into the pit, almost as if the builders decided, after constructing the chamber, to lower it further and adjusted the walls accordingly. These are not scars left by invasive treasure hunters. They're refinements carried out by people who cared about precision and continuity. In fact, in the descending section of the passage, there's still undressed stone, a kind of buffer left in place, seemingly to protect the finer finished walls during excavation. That's not the behavior of looters, that's conservation strategy used by builders actively reworking a space. The same logic applies to the absence of damage to symbolic architecture. In other pyramids, symbolic elements like false doors, burial niches, or decorative carvings are often partially preserved, even when lootings occurred. But in the Red Pyramid, none of that exists in the first place. That absence, coupled with the immaculate condition of the chamber walls, makes one conclusion more probable than any other. This room was never finished, never sealed, and never used as a tomb. We've been told to view this excavation as an act of violation, a desecration by desperate hands in a forgotten age. But the stone tells a different story. The pit wasn't hacked out in desperation, it was sculpted with care. The walls weren't broken, they were preserved. This is not the trace of criminals. It's the quiet evidence of construction. A chamber still in process when the project stopped for reasons we may never fully know. The Red Pyramid is widely celebrated as Egypt's first successful smooth-sided pyramid. It stands tall, symmetrical, and seems, at first glance, to embody architectural mastery. But once you look beyond its exterior, a very different story emerges. Despite its imposing facade, the Red Pyramid shows unmistakable signs of being left incomplete. Ironically, the pyramid that's most often called a finished masterpiece may have been abandoned before it ever fulfilled its intended function. Start with what's missing. Unlike other major pyramids of the Old Kingdom, the Red Pyramid lacks key ceremonial and funerary structures that typically accompanied a royal tomb. There's no causeway connecting it to a valley temple. There's no satellite pyramid nearby for ritual purposes. The mortuary temple on its eastern side is barely more than a minimal stone outline. And while enclosure walls exist, they are faint and unfinished. This is not a burial complex ready to receive a king. It's a site that feels like construction was halted halfway through the ritual phase. Now consider the lack of burial evidence. As discussed earlier, the upper chamber doesn't just lack a sarcophagus. It lacks any of the signs that would mark it as a functioning tomb. No inscriptions, no funerary iconography, no offerings, no blocking stones, no plaster ceiling. This is not just an empty chamber, it's a blank slate, and that emptiness cannot be reasonably blamed on looters. Other pyramids, even plundered ones, retain fragments of their ritual past. But here there is no trace of such activity, because it likely never began. So why was the pyramid abandoned? One theory is practical. The structure was repurposed or deprioritized in favor of new building projects under Sneferu's successor, Khufu. Another possibility is political. Sneferu's later reign may have seen shifts in power or resources that disrupted construction timelines. But the most compelling explanation may be internal to Sneferu's reign itself, that the pyramid was part of an evolving architectural experiment, and by the time it was complete enough to evaluate, the design was already obsolete. We see this pattern across his other pyramids. The Meidum pyramid was dramatically restructured. The Bent pyramid underwent mid-project redesigns, and the Red pyramid. It may have been built with lessons learned from both predecessors, but those lessons could have also revealed fundamental flaws in its function, ventilation, or symbolic layout. The missing floor in the upper chamber, for example, may reflect a failed attempt to adapt the space, an effort that was ultimately abandoned. And here's the paradox. The Red Pyramid's pristine condition has fooled generations of scholars into thinking it was a triumph. But that very lack of human activity, that absence of wear, ritual, or renovation suggests something different. Unlike the bent pyramid, which saw cult worship for nearly 1,000 years, the Red Pyramid appears to have been mostly ignored in antiquity. No significant tombs cluster around it. No known rituals were tied to it. Its chambers echo with silence, not legacy. In short, the Red Pyramid may not be the culmination of Sneferu's architectural journey. It may be the clearest sign that his mission was never completed. What we've called finished is merely intact, and what we've assumed was a final resting place may have been nothing more than an unfinished draft in a grand experiment, one that Sneferu's son, Khufu, would ultimately bring to resolution in the Great Pyramid. The so-called three-pyramid problem is often presented as a contradiction. Why did Pharaoh Sneferu build 3 massive pyramids, none of which show signs of being used as his tomb? But maybe the contradiction isn't in the pyramids. It's in our assumptions about what pyramids were for. What if the real problem isn't that Sneferu's pyramids don't match our expectations, but that our expectations are shaped by a flawed modern framework? The foundational assumption in most Egyptological thinking is that a pyramid equals a tomb. That logic stems largely from later periods, particularly the 5th and 6th dynasties, when pyramids were clearly constructed as burial sites with inscribed texts and funerary temples. But Sneferu ruled during a transformative period, early in the 4th dynasty, when large-scale pyramid building was still experimental. It was a time of architectural trial and error, of rapid evolution in royal ideology and religious expression. If we recognize that context, the 3 pyramids stop looking like failed tombs and start looking like milestones in a larger design process. In this light, the pyramids weren't static monuments built for a single purpose. They were living projects shaped by changing goals, ongoing discoveries, and possibly even political realities. Each one, Meidum, bent, and red, represents a different phase in Sneferu's architectural vision. They were not failures, they were iterations. The Meidum pyramid shows signs of dramatic collapse or reconstruction. The bent pyramid reveals mid-construction changes in its angle and chamber layout. The red pyramid appears outwardly complete, but inwardly unfinished. This isn't chaos, it's evolution. Much like an engineer builds prototypes before finalizing a product, Sneferu may have used each pyramid to explore the limits of form, function, and purpose. Importantly, there's no evidence that Sneferu was buried in any of them, nor that he intended to be. That opens the door to a possibility most mainstream narratives avoid. These pyramids may have never been meant for burial at all. They could have served symbolic, ceremonial, political, or even cosmological purposes we still don't fully understand. The absence of burial goods, sarcophagi, or sealing mechanism doesn't signal that something was lost. It signals that we may be asking the wrong question entirely. The problem arises only when we insist on a tomb-based interpretation that the physical evidence doesn't support. But if we drop that lens and allow the structures to speak for themselves, what we see is not a contradiction, but a coherent story of architectural experimentation. The pyramids change shape, internal design, and orientation. Their surrounding complexes vary in completion. Their chambers shift in function and finish. These are not the inconsistencies of failure. They are the fingerprints of adaptation. So maybe there's no 3-pyramid problem at all. Maybe there's only the story of a pharaoh who dared to think in stone and who kept changing the blueprint as he learned more about what a pyramid could be. If Sneferu's 3 pyramids were part of a long experiment in form and function, then his son, Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, may have delivered the final result. While Sneferu's monuments display signs of ongoing revision, structural adaptation, and incomplete use, the Great Pyramid of Khufu stands apart, not just because of its scale, but because of its clarity. It is internally consistent, architecturally resolved, and purpose-built in a way that none of Sneferu's pyramids quite manage. This suggests that the so-called three-pyramid problem wasn't a failure, but a process, and Khufu's pyramid was the answer. The Great Pyramid is often studied in isolation, but when viewed through the lens of Sneferu's evolving experiments, its design begins to make even more sense. It features multiple chambers, each with distinct functions and access routes. It incorporates advanced structural elements like the Grand Gallery, corbelled ceilings, and most notably, ventilation shafts, a feature conspicuously absent in Sneferu's pyramids. These shafts not only helped with airflow and humidity control, problems possibly identified in earlier pyramids, but they also may have had symbolic or ritual purposes, aligned with the stars, where Sneferu's pyramids have inconsistent internal plans, misaligned corridors, abandoned chambers, and unclear floor layering. Khufu's Great Pyramid is tightly integrated. Every passage and chamber aligns with the architectural intent. The king's chamber is designed with granite blocks fitted so precisely that modern tools struggle to replicate them. Above the chamber, 5 granite relieving chambers reduce structural pressure, an elegant solution likely influenced by weaknesses observed in the bent pyramid's corbelled ceilings. In essence, Khufu didn't just build a bigger pyramid. He synthesized lessons learned from Meidum, bent and read, into a single coherent structure. The issues his father encountered, collapsing casing, unstable angles, flawed ventilation, and non-functional burial chambers, are all absent from the Great Pyramid. That's not coincidence, it's design evolution. The fact that Khufu didn't replicate any of Sneferu's interior layouts is telling. He wasn't refining his father's mistakes, he was discarding them entirely in favor of a superior plan. This makes the three-pyramid problem less of a mystery and more of a prelude. Just as a writer produces drafts before delivering a final manuscript, Sneferu may have spent his reign in architectural exploration, providing Khufu with a blueprint, not just in stone, but in knowledge. The Great Pyramid, then, is not a sudden leap forward. It's the culmination of nearly 2 decades of experimentation, laid brick by brick across 3 monumental test cases. If this is true, it repositions Sneferu from a confused king building tombs he never used to a visionary who paved the way for one of the greatest structures in human history. And it casts Khufu not as an outlier, but as the executor of a perfected vision. A course correction, yes, but one built firmly on the lessons of the past. One of the biggest obstacles in interpreting ancient monuments isn't the age of the stone or the damage of time. It's modern bias. We look at structures like the pyramids through the lens of our own cultural assumptions, that monuments must have a singular purpose, that perfection equals success, and that tombs must contain remains. But the ancient Egyptians didn't think like we do, and by forcing our expectations onto their work, we risk distorting their intentions beyond recognition. The so-called three-pyramid problem is a case study in this distortion. Because we've decided that pyramids are tombs, the absence of a sarcophagus in any of Sneferu's 3 structures becomes a mystery that must be explained. But what if the mystery only exists because we're asking the wrong question? What if these pyramids don't fit our model, not because something is missing, but because our model is flawed? This bias manifests in countless subtle ways. Egyptologists often describe the Red Pyramid as perfect, because it looks the most like what we imagine a pyramid should be: tall, smooth-sided, structurally sound. But form doesn't equal function. Just because it looks finished doesn't mean it was used. Meanwhile, the bent pyramid, with its visibly altered slope, is described as a failure, despite its complex internal chambers and the fact that it hosted active cult worship for nearly 1,000 years after its construction. That kind of reverence doesn't follow a failure. It follows meaning. Similarly, when archaeologists find a skeleton in a chamber, such as the male remains discovered in the Red Pyramid, some are quick to assign royal identity despite no inscriptions, no sarcophagus, and no funerary context. Why? Because it fills the gap in the narrative. It allows us to say, see, it was a tomb after all. But storytelling isn't scholarship, and history built on convenience is rarely accurate. Our bias isn't just about what we want to find, it's about what we refuse to consider. The idea that a king would build pyramids for reasons other than burial seems absurd to many modern minds. Yet ancient rulers often commissioned structures for divine rituals, astronomical alignment, political legitimacy, or public spectacle. In that context, a pyramid without a burial isn't a contradiction. It's a possibility, one that makes more sense when we stop insisting that ancient people thought exactly like us. And this isn't just a theoretical problem. When we project our beliefs onto ancient architecture, we build interpretations that resist revision, even when the evidence demands it. We see this in the persistence of explanations like wooden sarcophagi, symbolic chambers, and looters who somehow remove tons of stone without leaving a trace. These are patches for a theory that has long outlived its usefulness. True historical understanding requires humility. It means accepting that we don't know everything and that sometimes the evidence doesn't support our favorite narratives. The three-pyramid problem may not be a problem at all. It may be a mirror reflecting the limitations of our perspective. And once we break that reflection, what remains is the chance to see ancient Egypt, not as we expect it to be, but as it truly was. After more than a century of excavation, study, and debate, the three-pyramid problem of Pharaoh Sneferu continues to confound conventional Egyptology. But maybe the real mystery isn't why these three massive pyramids lack sarcophagi, funerary goods, or signs of burial. The real mystery is why we ever assumed they should contain those things in the first place. Let's look at the facts. Three pyramids, Meidum, bent, and red, each with massive, carefully constructed superstructures. Each one contains internal chambers that were altered, rebuilt, or never completed. Not a single sarcophagus has ever been found in any of them. Not one burial inscription, not one sealed chamber, not one shred of direct evidence that these monuments were ever used as tombs. In response, scholars have proposed increasingly convoluted explanations: that the sarcophagi were made of wood and vanished, that they were removed by impossibly careful looters, that the burial chambers themselves were metaphorical sarcophagi, that Sneferu somehow moved between these structures, undecided even in death. None of these theories are grounded in the physical evidence. All are designed to protect a narrative we no longer need. Because once we strip away the assumption that pyramids must be tombs, the problem disappears. The so-called three-pyramid problem was never a design flaw or historical anomaly. It was a modern misreading, a case of interpreting the past through the lens of present-day expectations. What happens when we discard that lens? A clearer picture emerges. Sneferu wasn't confused or indecisive. He was experimental. Each pyramid reflects a different stage of learning. Meidum, with its collapse and rebuild, the bent pyramid with its angle change and dual chambers, the red pyramid with its precision yet unfinished interiors. These are not signs of confusion. They are iterations in a process of discovery. And that process didn't end with Sneferu. His son Khufu took the blueprint and completed it, creating the Great Pyramid of Giza, the most architecturally coherent and symbolically loaded monument of the ancient world. Far from being a historical anomaly, Sneferu's pyramids laid the groundwork for one of the greatest construction feats in human history. They weren't failures, they were drafts. The deeper lesson here is about how we approach history itself. When we cling to old models simply because they've been repeated long enough to feel true, we close the door to real understanding. But when we let the evidence speak, when we allow for change, ambiguity, and reinterpretation, we not only get closer to the truth, we gain something else: humility. The pyramids of Sneferu are not problematic. They're honest. They reflect a culture experimenting with eternity in stone. They show us a pharaoh who wasn't content with tradition, but who pushed boundaries, changed course, and left behind something more meaningful than a sealed tomb. He left behind the story of a process. So maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. It's not, why wasn't Sneferu buried in his pyramids? It's, why did we assume he was? Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If there's one thing we've uncovered, it's that sometimes the greatest mysteries in history aren't about what's missing, but about what we assume should be there. The three-pyramid problem isn't a flaw in ancient design, it's a crack in modern interpretation. And the more we follow the evidence, the more we realize the past isn't broken, it's just misread. If this video challenged how you think about ancient Egypt, make sure to subscribe. Leave a comment with your thoughts, your questions, or even your own theories. I read them all. And above all, ask your friends one simple question. Do they take their history for granted?